Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to talk about all those today with my guest, Stephen Koonin. He is the author of Unsettled, what climate science tells us, what it doesn't, and why it matters. Steve, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Great. Happy to be here, Robert.
I didn't warn you, but on the podcast, I asked my guests to introduce themselves. So imagine you don't know anyone, you've arrived somewhere, and you have 30 or 45 seconds to introduce yourself. Please, by all means, go ahead.
My name is Steve Koonin. I'm a theoretical physicist by training. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, educated in public schools, degrees at Caltech and MIT. I was in academia for 30 years, then in the private sector at BP for 5 years, then in the US government as Undersecretary for Science in the Department of Energy during the first Obama administration. And now for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been at NYU, where I'm a professor. I went there to start a center for big data and big cities. And for the last few years, I stepped down from that, and I'm now teaching courses in climate science and energy. And my shtick is to just inform people about the science and let them come to their own conclusions, not to try to persuade them.
That's a good introduction. Thank you. So, as I read your book and I was looking at it, I was thinking, okay, well, you've published a lot, and you said why you wrote it, that you want to inform, but you've been in academia. Could you have written this book and expected much of a future in academia if you were a young PhD looking for a job?
Absolutely not.
And why is that? Because I think that what interests me, you present a lot of interesting things in the book, but to me, it's the politics of the discussion are really what's the problem here, right? And the limitation of the discussion. So why, if you'd written this and you were 30 years old, could you have gotten a job? And if not, why not?
So, it's useful to try to separate the research from the public discussion. And I think the research is quite open and well discussed, and people write papers often with data that really does not necessarily agree with the standard narrative, and that's fine as long as you've backed up your data and done a rigorous analysis. It's when you get out into the public sphere, and writing a book is certainly a step into the public, where there start to be problems. And I believe that there is a culture of, I won't say suppression, but we just don't talk about certain things because they don't fit. And I grew up with an ethos that you tell the whole truth. And sometimes it's complicated, but that's your responsibility to inform decision makers of the whole truth. So could I have written this kind of book when I was younger? No. Could I have talked about the research that I might have done or other people did that doesn't align? Yes. And so there are things that go on, I hate to say behind closed doors, but outside of public awareness that I tried to surface.
So I noticed in the book was released May 4th, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And
Correct.
You published a couple of essays in one was in the New York Post. You did an interview with Holman Jenkins at the Wall Street Journal. But the fact that you published it in the New York Post, did you submit that piece to the New York Times, or would the New York Times have run this piece that you wrote?
So as I've discovered, attendant to the release of any popular book, at least with a PR team, as I do have, they're looking at all platforms to try to get the word out about the book. And certainly they have approached the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, and we'll see some of the UK papers this weekend. But most disappointingly, they've made great efforts to get on the more or the less conservative platforms, let me call it that way. CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, and in all cases but one, they've been ignored. And to me, this is unbelievable. I write a very carefully researched book on the basis of my experience in science over 50 years. It's all well referenced, very factual, non-political at all, and people seem to ignore it, at least on the blue side of the house. And
Well,
that
well,
amazes me.
and if I can interrupt you, because you say in your book, uh, climate alarmism, I'm quoting, you say, has come to dominate U.S. politics, especially among Democrats, where I've otherwise long felt most comfortable politically.
Yeah.
So this is what you're talking about is tribalism, and this is an issue for a lot of things in politics, but particularly it seems in the climate debate. So your own tribe doesn't want. I mean, from what I'm reading of your own discussion of your own politics, your own tribe doesn't want to hear this.
Yeah. And that's just amazing. Okay. It's, some people have said to me in the past, why are you talking about this in such a public way? And I have
Right, and
emails from,
you mentioned that in the book that some
yeah,
colleague of yours is saying, "Oh, well, I agree with you, but I'd never publish it myself."
yeah. So it's pernicious. And if we're ignoring the science in this, what else are we going to be ignoring the science? And, there are episodes in history where governments have intentionally ignored the science, eugenics in the early part of the 20th century, Lysenkoism, where the scientific establishment knew but could not persuade the government or the broader powers until something dramatic happened. I think in this case, if we keep going down the path we are going, particularly for the electricity system, using the climate crisis as an excuse or a reason, eventually we're going to see an electricity system that is so unreliable that the populace will start asking hard questions, and perhaps eventually heads will roll for people who have over exaggerated the need for a rapid and whole scale transformation of the energy system.
I'm glad you brought that up, Steve, because that's an issue that I've followed a lot. And I wrote my latest book on it, right? A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. And I've written and been talking a lot on this podcast about the closure of Indian Point, which to me is directly related to this issue I mean, even if you take climate issues away from it, you just ignore the zero carbon attributes of Indian Point and just say, well, it's a nuclear plant. Well, it gave New York City nearly a quarter of its electricity, gave fuel diversity, gave resilience, robustness, all these things, and it's being shuttered. And it seems to me that that's the part that I worry about the most is the grid overall and the reliability of it. But follow up on that if you don't mind. What are your feelings about the closure of Indian Point?
Yeah, so I live not far from Indian Point, where I am right now. It's about 20 miles away from me, and I happened to pass by it on Friday, which was the last day that it was online. I waved farewell to it, but I would agree with you. It seems like there's nobody really in charge of these decisions. When you ask what is supposed to replace the 2 point something gigawatts of electricity that the two units generated when they were operating, the answer is gas. But then you have a whole contingent of folks saying, no more gas, because it's a fossil fuel. So eventually, I think there's going to be a crisis. And as I say, the public's going to wake up and say, what the heck are we doing? I think in large part, it's the fact that the political folks are not technically trained at all. And we need to have more engineers weighing in on this rather than simply being cowed by a green fervor and just giving in. I mean, we saw it in California already. We'll probably see much more of that. Texas was a whole other situation, which you may know much better than I. We could talk about, but basically, if we put in too much wind and solar, the grid will go unstable, as you probably well know. And so we're going to need to get that baseload frequency regulation and baseload from somewhere. And we haven't thought that through.
And it is deeply scary to me. I mean, deeply scary because in researching the book and for the documentary I made in the book, we went to Indian Point, and it's just a marvel of technology. I mean, you've been a technologist your whole life, and I'm new to some of these things, but I've visited a lot of industrial facilities in my career, and Indian Point was just stunning. The power density, 2,000 watts per square meter. Are you kidding? 95 some odd percent availability. I mean, just a remarkable technical achievement that was built during a time when society, as I put it, thought big, right? It was started during the Eisenhower years, Unit 1.
Mhm.
And when America was able to think big, and the year that Eisenhower launched the interstate highway system, have we lost that then? I mean, you made a good point there about who's watching over this, right? Who's
Right.
responsible? And that seems to me deeply worrying because the
Well,
policymakers aren't
I mean, there
thinking
are many people watching over it. There's FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
sure.
There's NERC, North American Electricity Reliability Council. There is a New York ISO, Independent System Operator. So they are all watching. I think they're concerned. I talk to people who work for ISO, and they're very concerned. In terms of thinking big, I think we have as a society, and maybe it's just a natural consequence of society getting older demographically, but also getting a little bit fat and happy. We have lost the ability to think big. We do some great things. I think wonderful achievements. Vaccine, for example, just an amazing achievement of science. I think with respect to nuclear, the way forward is to think not so big and to promote smaller nuclear reactors. And you probably know the small modular reactors story very well. When I was in the government, I helped promote those. And I'm pleased to see now, about a decade later, they're making good progress. They're at the point where they've been applying for licenses. And again, initially, it'll be more expensive than, let's say, gas turbine. But if we can build enough of them and get the cost down, it could be a very favorable low emission source of electricity, if that's what the country wants, low emissions.
Sure. I agree with you, and I'm very hopeful for small modular reactors, and there's some really interesting ones and designs being made. But right now, still, they're unfortunately paper reactors, and the Chinese and the Russians are deploying at scale, and we're stuck, and we can't even keep, excuse me, we can't even keep Indian Point open, much less build new ones. So I mean, to me, and I wrote a piece on this recently, just quoting Lily Tomlin, no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up. I mean, if this is the if this is a crisis, then it's a lay down hand. It's a 2-inch putt. It's a layup. Well, sure, you keep this existing infrastructure open. That's you conserve, and instead,
in particular, it's low emissions if that's the goal. I think the other issue is the rapidity with which the change is being proposed. As you know, the Biden administration wants to go to zero emissions from the power sector in 2035. And I think that's so rapid as to be extraordinarily disruptive. And the people I talk to in the electricity sector who are very experienced say there's no way this is going to happen. I like to say we need to change energy systems by orthodonture, not by tooth extraction. And, what's being proposed amounts to almost a whole mouth renewal. So
I like that line in your book. I noted in fact, more akin to orthodontia than tooth extraction, as I remember your line. That's a good line. I might use it. I might steal it.
Good. Well, I stole it from somebody else in a different context, but we won't go there.
Picasso said amateurs borrow, professionals steal, or at least that is allegedly. Go ahead.
What we need is slow, steady pressure on the system, not crash decarbonization, if we want to do that. We also, of course, as you well know, need to fix the grid. Two-way flow of information, large amounts of storage would be a great idea, and a much more sophisticated management system for the grid, diagnosis and management than we have currently. The administration is proposing that, and that's one that I'm fully on board with.
And that's a challenge, and a big one. I mean, because the grid is so extraordinarily complex, and you have so many different actors. 3,000 different electricity providers, 900 co-ops, 2,000 publicly owned entities, the investor-owned utilities. Yep. Getting them all to dance to the same tune, that's difficult.
Yeah, okay. At an organizational level and an economic level, it's a challenge. But at a technical level, to put in PMUs, phase measurement units, synchrophasers across the whole system to diagnose and then analyze all of that information in terms of reliability. I think that's a doable do, and we're on the way to doing that.
So let me ask you, there's one point, and finally, just in terms of this, the media environment, which I'm familiar with, been doing journalism for 30 plus years now, I haven't seen much criticism of your book. There was one critique in Inside Climate News that kind of, didn't really attack you personally, although, which was interesting because they really, I thought, were trying to say, well, Koonin, he's not such a bad guy. But here's what Chu says, and here's what these other people say. But it seems to me, and there's some way, referring back to your career, you're not attack proof, but you were in the Democratic administration. You've been in academia. You're at Caltech. You have the credentials that seem like they've kind of maybe insulated you or given you some armor against what would otherwise be a lot of ad hominem, is my read. Is that, how do you read it?
Yeah, I think, I will say with some modesty, I do have some reputation and stature, and I've got a track record of weighing in with clarity on complicated issues. And so I hope that people will take the book seriously, will read it. I have tried to make the book relatively bulletproof because almost everything that's in the book is right out of the assessment reports or the quality peer-reviewed literature since. And so I think it's very hard for somebody to call me a denier because, in fact, I'm quoting the official science. It's just that these things never get surfaced. They're in the back of the report.
Well, let me ask
and
you
I
about,
find that very peculiar.
Well, let me ask you about that, because that was one of the things that kind of made me catch my breath as I read it. And you wrote about this issue of denier. You said, how can I be denying the science if I'm saying it straight out of the official data and reports? I find it particularly abhorrent to have a call for open scientific discussion equated with Holocaust denial, especially since the Nazis killed more than 200 of my relatives in Eastern Europe. Tell me about that. You're Jewish. Where do your roots go?
So I'm Jewish. My parents were born in this country. My grandparents emigrated from Middle Europe, Poland, Galicia, as it's called, Kovna, Lithuania. And on my mother's side, my grandmother and her generation, 200 of the extended family perished in the camps and other turmoil during World War II. So I remember meeting as a younger child relatives who had the tattoo from the camps on their arms. And so it was not a direct experience for me, but it's certainly part of the family DNA, if you like. And so when somebody says denier, that, I would use the word microaggression or macroaggression if I were 2 generations younger than I am. But it hurts a bit. And let's just stop that kind of name calling. All right, let's just talk about the science. But it's very hard to get to that kind of conversation.
Well, and it is such a loaded term because it involves this kind of it smacks of moralism, right? Oh, this is, or they kind of, how dare you? And no, you can't even bring this up because it's beyond discussion. And that to me is, look, I guess my politics about this are, okay, yes, there's no doubt that humans are affecting the climate. The question is how much and how do we respond? And those are the things that I think really your book is interesting in, that you clearly come down on the adaptation side rather than the mitigation side, which I've had Bjorn Lomborg on the podcast, and that's clearly the camp that he comes into. And the more I've looked at some of the mitigation plans that the Biden administration are proposing, including decarbonizing the grid by 2035, which is effectively impossible. I mean, you'd have to generate as much electricity just to replace coal and natural gas, as much electricity is produced by all global nuclear. And I've published on this in Forbes recently, 2,700 terawatt hours a year. It's just a staggering quantity. And you talk about the scale issues, but you say, in fact, that the many certain downsides of mitigation outweigh the uncertain benefits. And you talk about, and then you go on and say, the world's poor need growing amounts of reliable and affordable energy, and widespread renewables or fission are currently too expensive, unreliable, or both. And that, I think, is the absolute key point. And one of the points I make in my book and the film, there are 3 billion people in the world today who use less electricity than an average kitchen refrigerator in the United States. I mean, the poverty is so widespread. So how do we, going back to that moral question, how do we help these people come out of the dark and into the light, into the modernity, while saying, oh, no, but at the same time saying, oh, no, you can't use hydrocarbons? There's a moral issue here, isn't there?
That is, you could if you want to be nasty, you can say this is neocolonialism. Keep them in the dark at the expense of allegedly saving the planet. And I think that is immoral. There are other immoral acts which we can get to in a while in this business, but that certainly is, the way I like to say it is the fundamental question for those who are advocating global reductions in emissions is who is going to pay the developing world not to emit? And as I say in the book, I've been asking that question for 20 years and nobody's got a good answer. I mean, even the Green Climate Fund at $100 billion a year is not, if it ever came to pass at that scale, which is far below, but if it ever came to pass, that's still far less than what's needed in order to go to zero by 2050 or 2075.
Well, and I think isn't that the disconnect, Steve? And again, just if you're just tuning in, my guest is Steve Koonin. He's the author of Unsettled. I don't have the book. I have it on my Kindle. What climate science tells us, what it doesn't, and why it matters, which came out May 4th. But that's the challenge, right? And it's one of the points that Roger Pilkey Jr. has made over and over with the iron law. And I've seen it myself. The people who are living in poverty aren't happy there, and they're going to do whatever they can to get out of that poverty. They're not going to say, oh, the Yankees say we shouldn't have it, so we're not going to do it. I mean, isn't that the other part of the fundamental disconnect here? It's not just the moral judgment, but these independent actors, China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they're going to do what they need to do for their own national security and no national interest, right?
Right. And I mean, to be fair to the administration, their hope in the Paris Agreement is not that U.S. actions will make a big difference. And in fact, President Biden and Ambassador Kerry have said, in fact, it'll hardly make any difference unless the rest of the world comes along. Right. So I think they're hoping by moral suasion and, frankly, scare tactics to get the Chinese and the Indians and the Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Indonesia, all to come along and create a low-carbon energy system.
But is that even doable, though? I mean, you make your own the point, too, about hydrocarbons dominance, 80-some-odd% and particularly for the developing world.
If you said on a 2-century time scale or something, sure, but not now. We don't have the economic technology that has reliability and economics and safety to go with it. We just don't. And I can't blame the developing world. If I was sitting in Mumbai with a flaky electricity system, I'd worry about that much more than some vague, distant threat that greenhouse gases are going to destroy the planet.
And
human nature.
Right, and that's what we saw, and we saw it in Lebanon, we saw it in Puerto Rico, we saw it in India, that very same thing, which is that, people are worried about what they're doing today, not some issue that's farther in the future. Well, so let me ask you about that, because one of the other things I mentioned, Roger Pilkey Jr., who's been on the podcast, you point out RCP 8.5, which is of all the climate scenarios, is the one that is the most dire. Rather than having me attempt to summarize that, you write about it in your book. Can you summarize why that scenario is used, what it is, and why it's used so often? Because that is the most catastrophic of the scenarios that are being talked about.
So it is impossible to make precise predictions about what society is going to do over the next 80 years or so to the end of the century. And so what the IPCC did was to create a set of 4 scenarios, which are kind of possible futures for the world. And they're not meant to be predictions or even to be alternatives, but they just kind of span the range of what might be. And they're labeled by a number, which basically measures how strong human influences are by the end of the century in 2100. And they range from 2.4, RCP 2.4, RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, 2.4, which is basically we have managed to stabilize human influences what they are today, up to RCP 8.5, which is a very populous, coal-heavy world. And the models are run with these different scenarios in order to span the range of what might happen with the climate. And there has been a deliberate effort, documented in the New York Times, to portray the most extreme scenario, 8.5, as business as usual. And we've seen that infiltrate the scientific conferences, the scientific literature. I think Roger Pilkey Jr. has done a great job of documenting that. But we're now starting to see a come down, clawback, whatever you want to call it, of people who claim that's business as usual. And the more moderate scenarios are now believed to be much more realistic, largely because growth in the developing world has not been as rapid as had been anticipated, and there are reduced electricity needs because the globe is warming up a bit, and so we don't need cooling so much. That's in the developed world.
And coal consumption has plateaued. We've seen that. It hasn't fallen, but it hasn't grown. Nearly the projections in RCP 8.5, and I think that's
right.
maybe the key issue.
Right. It might go up again, as China and India crank up their economies post-COVID. I think there was a modest uptick in the last year. Yeah. Okay. But what is so immoral about that is to use those extreme scenarios to cite them as predictions of what will happen. And I've seen that in testimony by distinguished economists. And we use that to frighten young people and create depression and unwillingness to have children in the world because it's going to be so terrible. And that is immoral. All right. I will say that flat out. And I think the people who are doing that should be ashamed of themselves.
It's strong language.
Yeah, it is. Okay.
And I'm not Jimmy Swaggart, so I hesitate to talk about morality, right? But there is but when we're talking about the amount of money that is being proposed for mitigation efforts in the trillions of dollars. I mean, Wood Mackenzie, a very well-known energy consultancy, said decarbonizing the U.S. grid, just decarbonizing the grid, would be $4.5 trillion. Yeah. Well, then that's not talking about industry. That's not talking about transportation, which will be yet harder than just the electric grid. So we're talking about trillions of dollars to reduce CO2. But I have seen that myself from young people. I'm maybe about 10 years younger than you, I guess, that there's a bleakness in many of their outlooks that is based on these catastrophic climate changes. And what I think the gist of your book is, if I would paraphrase it, you're saying, well, the changes might not be as unlikely to be as drastic as we're being told, and if that's the case, then we have to be careful about how we spend our money. I mean, is that a fair summation?
Yes, we should be thoughtful. I'd like to summarize it. This climate change business, it's not a hoax, but it's not a horror either, and we will certainly be able to manage it in the course of our ordinary adaptation measures. But younger people should be optimistic about what's ahead for the world. Yes, the U.S. role or place in global affairs is changing because of the rise of other countries, and we need to figure out how we can best navigate that and not tie ourselves up so much with this doom and gloom and distraction about rapid decarbonization.
And is that role then, is the best way to think about that as one of attempting to continue in technological leadership? Because I think that's one of the strongest arguments in terms of the SMRs and development of nuclear in the United States, that here's an area where we can help cultivate and culture an industry that doesn't exist. And I fear that the time to market and the commercialization and the scaling up of that technology is going to be a very extended time. Tell me what you see in the SMR business. I've had several guests on the show talking about that.
Yeah, I'll talk about SMR in a minute, but let me talk about innovation more generally.
Sure.
I think, one of the most important ways that the U.S. can assure a place at or near the head of the table in the world is to make sure that we continue to innovate. And that's education. It means that we take in the most educated people from all over the world, which we have traditionally done, and give them, secure intellectual property rights, low-cost innovation, etc. Um, and I think that's a wonderful thing to do, but we have to be careful in energy innovation in particular. Where a technology is invented is different from where a technology gets manufactured,
Sure.
and is still different from where it gets deployed. And so we will make money not only if we invent, but we can manufacture as well. And the shift of solar cells manufacture outside of the US is a great example of how we failed to capture the economic benefit of manufacturing. So we got to make sure that we can manufacture. That means quality workforce, abundant energy is very important for manufacturing, reasonable regulation, et cetera, et cetera. All right,
Sure.
let me talk about SMRs.
Yes, thanks.
So, I mean, for people who don't know, the notion is to build small reactors, maybe 1/10 or 1/20th the size of the current generation of reactors, to build them by a standard design, which has much greater safety features built in than the current big ones. So the licensing would be a lot easier if the design is standard, because every reactor now, up until now, is different. And then build them in a factory, put them on a flatbed truck or a rail car, truck them to a site, and add them one at a time to a site so that they get ganged up. And of course, there are advantages to having multiple reactors at a site in terms of maintenance, security, refueling, and so on. And that's the notion. When I was in the government, and then subsequently the US DOE catalyzed the design and development of these reactors. I believe there's only one company left of the three that started 8 or 9 years ago, but it has gotten to the point where it is applied to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for licensing. And the hope is that, because these reactors are different than anything that the regulators have seen before, and so they're going to take some time to understand it. The notion of small reactors, by the way, is not at all new. We've been putting small reactors in naval vessels for 70 years or so.
Right, since Rickover, yeah, sure.
Yeah, right. But I mean, these are different. They can't use highly enriched uranium. We don't have the water around to cool as you would in a boat. Sure. But nevertheless, we know how to design these reactors. And the question is, can we assure the regulators that they are safe enough to deploy, and then get the first one demonstrated, perhaps at a national lab in Idaho, to wring out the kinks and then start to deploy them commercially.
Sure. And I believe you're talking about Oklo, which is the company. They've applied to NRC, and I've had their co-founder Carolyn Cochran on the podcast a few months ago. Which
did NuScale disappear? I mean, that was
NuScale is still around, right? But I've forgotten which one, Oklo or NuScale. NuScale is still around. Yeah, they were bought by. They're part of another company now. Forgive me for not remembering exactly, but yeah, I think that and you're right, exactly. These modular reactors or small reactors are not new. They've been on naval vessels for a long time, and then the Russians, I guess, deployed 2 naval reactors on their power ship in Siberia, which is really quite a remarkable thing. But let me follow up on that. It just occurs to me because it's one of the stumbling blocks, it seems to me, in terms of the deployment at scale of these types of reactors, is the requirement for heavy government involvement. And you see that with Rosatom, with the Russians, and of course CNPC we got that acronym right, the Chinese nuclear champions. Mm-hmm. Is it inevitable that we have to have a heavy government hand in that nuclear sector?
Yeah, well, you know that nuclear power, civilian nuclear power in this country was really a spin-off from the military programs. I think it's much less of a government hand now than it was. I mean, at one point, the government controlled the technology, controlled the fuel, and so on. And then it was loosened up in the 50s, I think, and then even again in the 60s. I think at the beginning, we're going to need that. And for these small reactors, inevitable. And, government regulation assurance of safety of these plants, I think, is absolutely essential. I would not leave that to the private sector. Sure. I mean, we've seen the problems, 737 MAX, the Texas electricity crisis a couple of months ago. Those are places where the government should have been more present, not to exercise a very heavy hand, but just to assure that the companies were doing the right thing. In the case of Texas, having plants that would run through the winter was absolutely essential, and they didn't do that because there was no money in it. So I think the government we've got to get the right balance between regulation and free enterprise. Yeah. I would say, as we look perhaps one day to the commercialization of fusion, and as you know, there are a number of private companies working to that, and a big international effort in ITER. I think there are lessons to be learned from how fission came to be, that some things we should and should not do. But that's still probably at least a decade away. We have to worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you make a good point about that balance between private enterprise and government. It's always the difficult balance, right? In terms of how capitalism is great and it works well, but it needs the counterbalance of proper regulation. And I think that's the key in terms of as you point out, and aptly, very, very rightly so. It was the problem here in Texas, where we had an energy-only market. There were no incentives for providing resilience, reliability. If you're only selling watt hours, why would you concern yourself with providing watts when watts are dear? And therein lies the problem. And to go back to your earlier point, who's in government? It's not engineers, it's lawyers. And why are the lawyers? Why are there so many lawyers? Because they couldn't do the math to get into engineering school. But that's a different.
I'm not going there.
Let me talk about.
I mean, it is a failure of our education system that more people cannot do simple quantitative thinking.
No, and I agree with you, and I think it's particularly apparent when it comes to energy and power systems, because the overwhelming majority, and I've written about this now for more than a decade, they don't know the difference between energy and power. They don't know the difference between a watt and a watt hour. Well, it's not the same thing, and they're continually confused, even by people in the energy business. And so it is a remarkable lack of knowledge that I think the people who are rent seeking can very easily exploit.
So my own experience just in that, I was a educated scientist, faculty member, working in various fields. But until I moved into BP, I had no idea of what it took to provide either fuels or electricity reliably. And I now teach that at NYU to a mix of engineering and business students. And their eyes light up when you show them what the grid is really about and how difficult and how much work goes into assuring reliability. So we've made it too easy.
Made it too easy just to plug in and not think about it?
Yeah.
Well, so let me ask you about Richard Feynman, because you refer to him several times in your book, and I read, it's been some time, I read James Gleick's wonderful biography of him, Genius. And it's been some time ago, so I'm not remembering a lot of it, aside from, it was, very flattering and some unflattering parts about Feynman. But you were both New Yorkers, and you said in the book that you went to Caltech because of him. What made him different? What made him so magnetic? And what was, he was he was involved with the Manhattan Project, and you speak very fondly of him.
Yeah. For me, he was an icon of what a scientist should be. Not only his brilliance, he was really smart and imaginative. Used to, the phrase that sticks in my mind is to look at the world from a different point of view. And often he would come up with insights like that. He was also a superb teacher. A bit of a performer, actually a lot of a performer, and you can see that in his famous recorded lectures. I think he was most known to the students, both before we got to Caltech and when we were there, for a famous set of 3 lecture books on elementary physics. But of course, knowing Feynman, it wasn't elementary at all. And you didn't really appreciate them until you had most of a PhD, and then you could understand just how brilliant the exposition was. I knew him a bit as a student, knew him also as a faculty colleague, but we never worked together. I certainly took a class from him, and he was at lectures. I saw classes and lectures that he taught. But nevertheless, he was a real presence on the Caltech campus. And I invoke him in the book because of his rigorous adherence to scientific integrity. And there's a wonderful passage in a speech he gave at the Caltech commencement in 1974 that I quote in the book. It's kind of a central theme, and that's got to do with the steps a scientist has to take to avoid fooling not only themselves, but also others. And he gives this anecdote, which I'm happy to recite roughly.
Sure.
He says in the speech, last night I saw an advertisement for Wesson Oil. And the advertisement said, Wesson Oil doesn't soak through food. And what Feynman says is, yeah, but if you look a little harder, you realize that all oils don't soak through food. And if you get the temperature high enough, they all do. And he says that's the difference between informing and persuading. And that is kind of a central theme or stance for my book. I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to make it an unbiased and transparent exposition, but you're going to see everything. No propaganda. And I think that is relatively rare in these climate and energy discussions.
Well, and it's not only is it rare, what I see, and even from attacks on me, from attacks on Roger Pilkey Jr. by not just other faculty members, or not other academics, but by members of Congress. What was one of the Arizona congressmen demanded to know about his funding. Judith Curry, who has taken a somewhat similar skeptical stance about catastrophism, really drummed out of academia because of what she calls the harassment that she received, in fact, directly from Michael Mann, whose publisher is Public Affairs. He's on the same imprint as I am. But it's fairly, to me, I'm not an academic, never have been, never will be. It's fairly scandalous, this lack of rigorous debate about some of the central questions of our time. I mean, is that one of, it seems to me that was one of the motivators for you to do this, because you could have easily just shut the heck up and just, you got a good job at NYU. They're not gonna drum you out. But I mean, you were compelled to do it. Why?
I see it as a fundamental responsibility of some of us scientists who have experience in science advising, and in my case have enough background and experience to look at the science as well as the energy technologies to just try to better inform the debate. When I see people talking about climate crisis and existential threat and so on, I'm wondering, what are they really talking about? I'm reminded of the line from The Princess Bride, you keep using the word the science, and I don't think the science says what you think it says. And in fact, when you read these reports, they do not agree with what's being said publicly, either by the politicians or by some of the scientists. And, I'd love to be in a conversation with Dr. Mann or Jim Hansen or Gavin Schmidt and say, Gavin, it says this in the report. How come we don't know that? Or we haven't heard that? And how come, do you think it's right or not? And, I'll put them in the position of denying the consensus.
And do you think that's going to happen?
I doubt it. I'd be delighted if it did, but I doubt it. What I'd like to see, in terms of a rebuttal of the book, let's get down to specifics. The very specific points in the book. I've even made a spreadsheet of them, chapter by chapter and page by page. And let people criticize at that level, rather than simply saying Koonin's an idiot, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's bending the truth. Let's get that down on paper, and then let's have a public discussion.
Well, so and I appreciate that. To me, the issue is not so much. I mean, it doesn't even have to get into the climate science in terms of mitigation. It's just simple math. Can you hit these targets? In chapter 12, you talk about the carbon-free chimera. You say there's ample reason to doubt that the Paris 2030 goal can be achieved. A similarly realistic view of the longer term is that the world is very unlikely to zero out its net emissions by 2075, let alone by 2050. So society will largely respond by adapting. That I have to say I completely agree with you, because I just, to your point, and it's one Václav Spill has made many times as well, is that energy transitions are slow. I mean, Edison used coal on Pearl Street. We're still using coal today. So this idea that we're suddenly going to go to something else, and I just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about the issues, in citing wind energy, that, all these rural communities saying, no, hell no, we don't want these 500-foot wind turbines. Are you kidding? And yet they're promoted as being the solution here. So I guess that's the key point. Is my question is that this conflict between spending, and we've talked about this a little bit, but spending enormous amounts on mitigation, when the reality is whatever happens, we're going to have to adapt. And would the money be better spent on that, is the question.
That's right. I would agree. By the way, I did see the Wall Street Journal piece on wind. I thought it was great. I mean, you again get down to specifics, which is lacking so much. I think, as we talk either in books or in op-eds or public presentations about these problems, we don't carefully distinguish between what could be done, what should be done, and what will be done. And I'm very careful in the book to stick mostly to the could discussion, which is in the end about technology, maybe economics. The discussion of what will be done is again an observation, a descriptive discussion. You can look at trends and what people might be willing to spend and so on. And I conclude that adaptation is going to be the dominant way society responds. But people often mix up that with the should. And, we should go carbon free and so on. And, I think mixing those three questions up really confuses the debate or the discussion. And we need to take it slowly and thoughtfully.
Well, I'll follow up on that, because you write in chapter 13, and I think this follows on that really well. You say about the Manhattan Project, and of course Feynman worked on the Manhattan Project, and you say that the real Manhattan Project was carried out in secret, only had to produce a few specific atomic gadgets, had a nearly unlimited budget, and did not aspire, I'm quoting you directly here, did not aspire to transform a large system already embedded throughout society. The question I wrote down was, why is that techno fix so attractive? And because we've heard, we need a moonshot. I think I heard Secretary Granholm say that very thing just the other day. And we've heard about the Apollo project, and we hear that, if only we work hard enough, we're going to be able to solve this. But you use that line I'd not seen before, the techno-societal challenge.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead.
Right. No, you look at the moonshot or you look at the Manhattan Project, they did not aspire to develop technologies that would be broadly deployed throughout society. The Manhattan Project produced a couple gadgets, as they were called, for the military, a single customer who had almost unlimited funding. The moonshot, again, a government customer, the only customer at the time, and also large amounts of funding. They didn't have to transform all of society. That was not their purpose or goal. Whereas anything you do in energy has got to do that, transform society. Otherwise, it's not going to have any impact. So it's fundamentally different. And I think people who don't understand the energy system or don't understand technology look at those analogies as easy fixes, but they were fixes for a very different problem.
Yeah. So just a last couple things, because I want to make sure we don't run over time here. you mentioned, well, I'll ask you this question because I think it's one that Roger Pilkey Jr. has formulated. But in your view, then, what's is the best no regrets pathway? Then continuing R&D, developing SMRs, continuing focus on adaptation. What are those? I know you listed several others, but I think I've hit on the main ones. What are the other ones that I'm missing there?
Yeah, so I think we're going to see, with significant benefit, an increasing electrification of the light duty fleet. So electric
in automobiles,
cars. In automobiles, particularly passenger cars and SUVs. I think the batteries are improving enough. We will slowly get to the charging infrastructure and grid capability, and there are ample benefits to that if we got to that point. Fuel price stability, electricity prices are much more stable, reduction in local pollution from the internal combustion engine. You can go on and on. I teach some of this in the course, of course. But it's going to take a while, and I don't think we should push it too rapidly. Of course, it's not happening very rapidly anyway. As you probably know, plug-in vehicles are a couple % of U.S. sales right now. You've got issues with range, temperature dependence, that we need to, charging time that we need to sort out and improve upon.
Cars catching fire.
All of that.
A couple of last few things, Stephen. My guest is Stephen Koonin. He's the author of Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. So you've been at this game for a while. Who do you admire? Who do you read and think that they have a good handle on these issues?
Oh boy, I love Smill, as do many people do, and as you may have seen, he wrote an endorsement of my book. I'm particularly proud of that. I mean, there are other wonderful endorsements as well, but Smill has got such a great way of looking at these things.
And he's incredibly prolific. I wonder whether the guy sleeps at all. It's just incredible how much he produces.
When I started learning energy, those were the books I benefited from most. Not coincidentally, Bill Gates, of course, cites him as one of his inspirations as well. So I'm particularly proud that he wrote a very nice endorsement for my book. I hope that'll induce Bill to read it. We'll see.
So then, go ahead.
No, I was going to say on I think, the late David Mackay wrote a pretty good book on renewable energy. It's kind of UK centric, and it doesn't talk about economics, but I like the way he looks at things as well. I was one of the early critical readers of that book at his request, so I saw an advanced copy that was really good.
He did a great job on the power density analysis on that and land use, which is an area that I've looked at for a long time.
Yeah. On the climate side, and this may come as a surprise, I benefited a lot from a book by Ray Pierre Humbert, who was a professor at Chicago and is now at Cambridge, I think, or Oxford, one of the Oxford universities. And you might be surprised at that because he wrote a scathing reply to the first Wall Street Journal article I wrote and put it in Vox magazine, I think, or Slate. It was in Slate. But when you look at his science, it's great. But he's one of these scientists that have a very different research personality as opposed to a public personality. And so I like what he's written on the research side. It's very good and very educational. But the public persona and the public statements are so at odds with what he says in the books.
Last question. What gives you hope?
Like all educators, it's to get people to understand. And I think, as Feynman said, you can't fool nature. And eventually, if we wind up creating a deficient electricity system or transportation system, society will right itself, but be at some cost. And if we don't, okay, there will be opportunity cost to having created such a system. Those are the things I worry about, but also give me hope. I was talking last week with a group of distinguished young people at the graduate student postdoc level, and they're really interested in these matters. They're all scientists or engineers, but they're also eager for a straight story. And that gives me some hope.
Well, let's end it there then. Unless you have something else you'd like to add, then I think that's
No,
a
I'm
great,
good.
great place to stop. Well, great. My guest has been Stephen Koonin. He's the author of Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. Out now. I have it on my Kindle. You can get it on your Kindle, I'm sure, from all the good and major booksellers. Steve, thanks again for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. And the rest of you out there in podcast land, tune in next time for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see you later.